Hello, everybody. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have a very special guest. It's David Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States. A lot of people are familiar with the name GAO, General Accountability Office. It used to be called the General Accounting Office. It's basically the watchdog of the entire U.S. government. David was appointed to be our watchdog, and he's been the watchdog for America, not just specific things the federal government is doing, programs, but the entire overall picture, the entire fiscal policy that the country is running. He's been focused on fiscal sustainability for decades. And I met David when he was Comptroller General. He asked me to come visit with him, and he was very concerned about the generational implications of the fiscal policy we're running. This was back several decades ago, two decades ago, I guess it was. And then I was also very concerned writing with colleagues about generational accounting and fiscal gap accounting and coming up with new ways that economists could help the politicians see what we were leaving for our kids. You know, President Jefferson was very opposed to government debt of any kind. He felt each generation should pay its own way. And what we've gone for is from that perspective to let's have each generation of children pay for their parents. And let's tell those kids that don't worry how much we're taking from you, because you can always expropriate your children when you have your chance. So David, why don't you give us your bio, rather than my kind of walking through your bio, which is going to bore people. You were born in Alabama, and I know that, but tell us where you went from. You went from a little baby to becoming Comptroller General, but you've had lots of other government jobs. I think you've held 3 government different positions, appointments, and you've been appointed by both Republicans and Democrats. You've also run for office. Tell us the whole story.
Sure, I'll give you the executive summary, Larry, in the interest of time. Born in Alabama, raised in Alabama and Florida. I'm a CPA by training, by profession. Worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers, was a global partner with Arthur Andersen, ran a worldwide line of business for them. I've run 3 federal agencies, 2 in the executive branch, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, the Employee Benefit Security Administration, 1 in the legislative branch, the Government Accountability Office, where I was Comptroller General of the United States. I've also been a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. There are 2 public trustees. I did that for 5 years when I was a partner with Andersen. I have also been the chairman of the Audit Committee for the United Nations. I've been a professor at the United States Naval Academy. I've run 2 not-for-profits focused on fiscal responsibility and government transformation. I'm on the Defense Business Board and several other not-for-profit boards at the present point in time. I've been fortunate. I've had a lot of opportunities that I've been able to capitalize on. I've run organizations in the public, private, not-for-profit sector. And for somebody who's supposed to be retired, I'm awful busy. And my wife reminds me of that quite frequently. And by the way, we have 2 kids and 3 grandkids.
Oh,
yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. How did you kind of set out on this course? Were your parents you've been so socially minded and so involved in helping the country in so many different ways? Where did all that come from? Fundamental motivation?
Well, my family came to this country in the 1680s, and I have ancestors who fought and died in the American Revolution, and so does my wife. And so we are students of history. We also like to learn from history, learn from others. My dad was in the Navy at the very end of World War II. I wanted to go to the Naval Academy to be a Marine Corps aviator, but I couldn't go because I have a bad left ear. But the good news is I became a general anyway, and there's only been 8 Comptroller Generals in the history of the country, and I can assure you that people are a lot more fearful of Comptroller Generals than somebody with stars or stripes on. I can tell you that right now. So, and the good news is when I quit working full time, I got recruited by the Naval Academy to be a professor, and I can assure you, being a professor is better than being a plebe. There's no question about it. So, I personally believe that everybody ought to give some time to the country. It doesn't have to be in the military. It doesn't have to be in government service. It could be in occupations where the country has a need, or in geographic locations where that are underserved. So I'm actually for national service. Uh, I knew that I would give time to my country at some point in time. It turned out that I've given over 20 years of my life, which is one of the reasons I'll never be wealthy, because I'm honest. There are people in politics that aren't honest, that aren't wealthy, even though their salary is not that high. But I'm not going to go there. I did, in a moment of temporary insanity, succumb to the request of the professional community and the business community in Connecticut, which is really gone from a leading state to a laggard state in the last several decades, to run for governor of Connecticut, and ultimately I dropped out because they couldn't handle somebody from Alabama running for governor of Connecticut, and in addition to that, the I found out that elective politics is not a merit and integrity based endeavor. And I am a merit and integrity based person, as I'm sure you are too, Larry. And so, that's kind of the executive summary.
I see. And given the fact that you've lived in Connecticut, you probably even in Florida and Virginia now, and
Georgia, Texas, New York City, I've been around. I've been to 100 countries, every continent. So I've had a pretty good perspective.
do you think the country, let me just, before we start talking about the specifics of the U.S. fiscal condition right now, but and also the political scene as it's uh, the very interesting situation we're in right now. But do you think the country's as divided as many do? Do you think it's really red and blue? Or do you think we're more divided than we've ever been? Do you think we can come together? You're a Southerner, but a Northerner. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the country is divided because that's what the political parties want. But at the same point in time, when you look at party registration, the largest party registration is unaffiliated or independent, which is what I am. And it's it's mid 40 percentiles, up significantly, all-time high. The parties are losing market share. I believe that most Americans are right of center with regard to economics and things like fiscal policy, and center or center left with regard to social policy. Uh, the parties, however, have been taken over by the extremes, what I call the wingnuts, far right, far left. And because of the way that our political system runs with regard to redistricting and campaign finance and a variety of other factors, it makes us more divided. I'm less concerned, quite frankly, with the partisan divide, because we've had it from time to time. It's exacerbated when the margins are very close, which is what they are now and have been, where every election is about control, and there's a huge difference as to whether or not you're in the majority or minority, especially in the House. The thing I get concerned more about, Larry, and I talk about it in the book, is the ideological divide. The divide between people who believe in our founding principles that made us great and can keep us great and can stand the test of time, with the understanding that we're always striving to form a more perfect union. We'll never be perfect, but we're striving to be better. And those that believe in socialist state principles. I think that's the biggest divide. And part of that, when you talk about fiscal and monetary policy, which I know we're going to get into, was evidenced by the modern monetary theory. That's a socialist principle. Okay, you don't worry about deficits, don't worry about debt.
I guess I wouldn't call it socialist. I would just call it stupid.
Well, it is stupid, but they both start with an S, you know, so we can,
Yeah.
we can,
I mean,
we can use both.
it's
Yeah.
these kind of folks are parading as economists and really don't have the credentials to be a dog catcher, as far as I can tell. I mean, I've debated the people who are the leaders of this group, and it's almost a cult. And then you ask them, well, could you show me mathematically what you're actually saying? Because what you're saying verbally, nobody can follow. No decent economist can follow. Nothing. So
Well,
there's
let's talk about that just for a second. Let first for your listeners and or viewers, the modern monetary theory is a macroeconomic theory that basically says that deficits and debt don't matter as long as you can borrow in your own reserve currency, unless and until you have excess inflation. The problem with it is it's contrary to history, contrary to long established economic principles, based on a flawed comparison to Japan. And it was promulgated primarily by the leading economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, Stephanie Kelton, who's SUNY in New York. Now you know why Bernie Sanders never wanted to answer the question of how much was it going to cost, because he didn't care how much it was going to cost. The problem is it resulted in excess inflation. And one party was in power in Washington during the first 2 years of the current administration, and they followed the modern monetary theory. And until there was a change of control in the House, there was not a check and balance on that. Although we still very much have a spending problem, and there's not a party of fiscal responsibility today, I can tell you that.
Yeah. I mean, all one has to do is kind of go through the thought experiment of reducing all the taxes we have to zero, leaving them there forever, but maintaining the spending, and think about what would happen the next minute in the financial markets, and what would happen to prices. They would skyrocket,
Yeah.
because the only way the government could make money is by making money. So that would be Weimar, the Weimar Republic of Germany in the 1920s, where people were paid in wheelbarrows full of marks that were trillions of marks, and you got in a wheelbarrow at lunchtime if you're a worker, and then you had to immediately take it to the store to buy goods, because otherwise by the end of the day they'd be worthless.
Right here, Larry, this is a $100 trillion, yes, I said trillion, Zimbabwe bill, and probably worth $1 or $2 in US dollars. But that's what happens when you lose control. And obviously the Weimar Republic is a
Yeah.
good example that people might be more familiar with, although Americans aren't very good at history.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's always people who think that there's a free lunch. I mean, there is a free lunch for our country associated with having people who are sensible running it and reforming our institutions fundamentally, healthcare, Social Security, the tax system, the education system, so that we can get back on a track of real growth, of significant growth. We're kind of muddling along. We are growing, but for a large fraction of the workforce, there's been no real economic progress for decades to speak of. There's been a huge increase in wage inequality, and that could get worse as AI and other forms of smart machinery, of automation come about. So we have major. We're going to need to improve education and redistribute from the winners to the losers, but in a way that leaves people with incentives to work. What you want to call, or the group that you would call socialists, I wouldn't necessarily give them that name, but what they don't understand is that if they think they're well intended, which I think that maybe they are, but then they're putting together programs which are locking the poor into poverty, and then they want to add more programs. I mean, we've already locked the poor into poverty beyond belief, because if they earn too much money, they're going to start losing all these different benefits: Medicare, food stamps, housing support, welfare, child care, earned income tax credit, list goes
Yep.
on. And but let's talk about fiscal policy, the overall picture. Where do you see things in the short run and the long run for the country? Are we bankrupt? as a nation.
We're not bankrupt because we can continue to pay our bills, but we're clearly in much worse financial condition than the politicians tell you. And for many years now, all the major fiscal and monetary agencies have said that we're on an unsustainable fiscal path, which has gotten worse, since I left as Comptroller General. I mean, the things that I really focus on, Larry, are three things. Number one, debt as a percentage of GDP. It's too high, and it's projected to go much higher. Okay, and there's different ways to measure that: public debt, to GDP, or total
Yeah,
debt
let me
subject
just
to debt.
interject, the CBO's numbers, 2008, it was 30% of GDP. We're now at 97%. The
Right.
most recent projection is the 2053 will be at 180, over
And
180%.
that's just public debt, right? If you look at debt subject to the debt ceiling, we're already at 125. And, and as you and I know, if you look at unfunded civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, you look at unfunded Social Security and Medicare on a 75-year open group valuation, there are different ways to measure it. We were 125 trillion plus already, all right, and growing much faster than the economy. So I look at debt to GDP, mandatory spending as a percentage of the budget, and interest as a percentage of the budget. All of those are flashing red lights, and nothing meaningful is being done to deal with it. In fact, both of the major presidential candidates, they had a debate last Thursday night. Trump clearly won, but primarily because Biden was so terrible. But neither one of them had a credible answer to what are we going to do to put our finances in order, and what are we going to do to save Social Security. And that's just not acceptable.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
one thing when Washington doesn't do anything when things are going well, but it's another thing when Washington doesn't do something when things aren't going well and they're getting worse with the passage of time. And that's where we are now.
Yeah, let me summarize our situation from the perspective of what an economist who's looking at all the programs, the federal programs. So we're looking at all the entire path of outlays as projected by the CBO and extended because they don't project that far out, but you can extend their projection pretty easily. And you look at all the receipts, and you look including any income from assets that we have, and the outlays would include, servicing the debt. So don't call it official or off the books or on the books. Just look at the outlays, look at the receipts, present value those based on our historic return to U.S. wealth, which we can figure out from the data. And what it shows is that we have a huge fiscal gap, and that in order to get that fiscal gap down to zero, so that we can pay for if we wanted to really just say raise the path of receipts, but keep the path of outlays as they are projected, such that we would not have to raise taxes ever again. And of course, this is based on current, the current state of the world, and things can change. But based on the current state of the world, we need a roughly 45% increase in the entire path of receipts. That translates into raising every single federal tax rate by at least 45%. I mean, we're talking massive tax hike. And if we don't do it now, this is immediate and permanent tax hike of 45%, every single corporate income tax rate, payroll tax rate, personal income tax rates, everything. If we don't do it now and we wait, let's say 10 years, that number goes up. So now we're talking more like 48%, and then it goes up to 55%. As the longer you wait, the more that people like us will have been able to get through the end of our lives, spending more money, going on more vacations, going to more restaurants, not having to pay as much in taxes. And when the tax hikes eventually happen, and I know we can also cut the spending path, but let's just talk about doing it through taxes. Then we're talking about our kids, bankrupting our kids. And
yeah, let me come back. First, our current path is not only unsustainable, it is irresponsible, it is inequitable, it is immoral. because what we are doing is that we are mortgaging the future of our country, our kids, grandkids, and future generations at the same point in time when they're going to face a lot tougher competition and increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. That needs to stop. We have lost our way with regard to a key term under which our country was founded, and that term is stewardship. And what it means is that you don't just generate positive results today. You don't just leave things better off when you leave than when you came. You leave them better positioned for the future. And I hate to say it, but our generation, Larry, is not discharging its stewardship responsibility in a variety of ways, including fiscally. And that's not acceptable to you and I. And that's one of the reasons that we continue to fight. We just need more of we, the people, to join us because the politicians are lag indicators. They're focused on the short term. They're focused on their jobs. They're focused on, give people more and tax people less. The math just doesn't work over time on that basis.
We're in a slow path to Argentina. We're basically copying Argentine policy for the last century. Back in 2020, Argentina's per capita GDP was 14% of ours. Today it's, sorry, 85% of ours. Today it's 14%. And it's been a century of just
Slow
irresponsible.
deterioration, yeah. And
Yeah,
that's what'll happen to us. I mean, we're not exempt from the laws of prudent finance. Again, we need to learn from the past, we need to learn from others. I lay out a lot of that in the book.
So tell us about the book a little bit, because
Yeah.
and any other thing that you'd like to have people read, but because we haven't really mentioned the book, the name of the book, where you can get it,
Sure.
publisher. And
Yeah,
you have another book that was a national bestseller.
I
So
did. Yeah, I did.
talk about all your books.
Well, I've authored 4 books. Okay, the first 3 were published when I was working for somebody else, either Arthur Anderson or the Comeback or the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, and I did it to try to impart knowledge. I didn't make a dime on them because all the proceeds went to my employer, and therefore I didn't make a dime on it. The last book was Come Back America. It was a national bestseller. The first 3 books were published by major publishers. The most recent book that I did, I self-published, so I knew it was not going to make any bestseller list or whatever. I did it to impart knowledge. I wrote it because I was a professor at the Naval Academy teaching the economics of national security. I had to put that course together from scratch. After I taught it a couple of semesters, I decided, well, I might as well write a book on this, but not an academic treatise, one that could resonate with a broad cross section of America. It's a wake-up call, a call to action, and a way forward. It talks about national security, economic security, international standing, and domestic tranquility. It paints a picture of what things could be like in 2040 if we don't change course. It's lessons from history, lessons from our founders, lessons from others, and most importantly, it includes illustrative solutions that have gained supermajority support from the American people on what are the kinds of things that need to be done, let's say for fiscal, budget controls, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare, defense, government organization operations, taxes, political reforms. So it's heavy on the fiscal because if we don't put our finances in order, we're not gonna be able to say yes to the answer on the cover of the book. But it also addresses things, like border security and and other issues that are of concern to the American people, and immigration, for example. Yeah.
So
You
the
can get
books,
it at Amazon. You can get it at Amazon. It's only available. It's just in time, printing. You can get it either in a paperback version or you can get it in ebook version, either one.
it's called America in 2040.
Colon, still a superpower, but the website is just americain2040.com. Keep it short.
America in 2040, but the title of the book is, give me exactly the title for the
The
book.
exact title of the book is America in 2040, still a superpower, a pathway to success. And the bottom line is the answer to the question is yes, if you follow the guidance in the book, and no, if you don't.
Right. And even under, I want to talk about the specifics of what's in the book in a second, but I just want to mention that China's, our per capita GDP has been growing, but slowly, very low growth rate. China's about 4 times higher per capita GDP growth rate, 4 or 5, and then India is also growing. So even though China's per capita GDP is probably about 20% of ours right now, and even though it's aging and their one-child policy is it's over officially, but unofficially, they're not having kids. So the population is projected to decline by 400 million people. That's more people than we have in the US by the end of the century. India, on the other hand, is going to grow by about 400 million because they're still having a lot of kids, but the two together, I wrote a paper that's on at Kotlikoff.net under articles. It's called The Future of Global Economic Power with co-authors. And it shows that if you just put all the demographics and the economics together and the fiscal policies together, you get China and India controlling about 45% of world GDP under conservative assumptions about their per capita growth continuing. Compared to ours, continuing more rapidly. So we become like we end up with about 11% of world GDP by the end of the century. China, India are 45%. The European Union is around 10%. And that's partly also the demographics. So the world is very different. So if we want to maintain American hegemony, we cannot afford to screw things up and bankrupt our kids to the point where they have no incentive, raise taxes on their heads so they have no incentive to work and indeed leave the country. Uruguay is an example of that kind of policy. At some point, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, their tax rates were so high that, or maybe it was a little bit later, maybe in the 90s, 500,000 people from this small country got up and left, a lot of them to Spain, because they just couldn't make a living. They could make a living, but then it all went to the government, so it was just not worth working. And we need to simplify and radically improve the fiscal program, in my view, fiscal system, tax reform. But David, tell us about the solutions that you came up with in your book, maybe starting with the tax system, maybe then moving to healthcare, Social Security. What do you think we need?
We'll obviously time doesn't allow us to get into every area in a lot of detail, but I can give you an overview. Let me give you a bottom line statement. The federal government has grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, and undercut states' rights. We don't need a nip and tuck. We need radical transformational reform on what the government does, how the government does it, at what level of government it's done, and who does it, okay? And from a fiscal policy standpoint, we want to focus on debt to GDP. It's too high now. It's projected to get much higher, as you mentioned, okay? So that means we want pro-growth policies, because if you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, even if the numerator is going up, you're making progress. That's what we did post-World War II. But because of demographics and because mandatory spending is so high and a variety of other things, we're not going to be able to repeat that. So we want pro-growth policies, but we also have to recognize that our spending is above post-World War II levels and headed up as a percentage of GDP. Our taxes are below post-World War II levels and headed up a little bit, but not a lot, okay? And so we're going to have to make tough choices on mandatory spending, which includes social insurance programs, on discretionary spending, including defense, and on tax policy. The solution is going to be pro-growth, much more reductions in projected spending than increases in revenues, but you're going to have both. The idea that you can solve the problem just through growth doesn't pass a straight-faced math test, especially given demographics and our relative position in the world. Secondly, the idea that you can just cut your way out into the problem is not politically feasible. the idea that you can tax your way out of the problem, which you talked about before, is an economic disaster. Okay, and so the point is we got to make tough choices. So what the book does is it paints the picture of why we need to make tough choices. It gets people to agree on a debt to GDP goal. It gets people to agree on 6 principles and values that should guide all the decision making. And then it ends up gaining 77 to 97% support on specific illustrative solutions in the areas that we talked about: budgeting, Social Security, taxes. On taxes, executive summary, since you raised that first, okay? Our tax system is incredibly complex. Most people, can't handle it, all right? We need to dramatically simplify the tax system. We need to dramatically reduce the number of tax preferences that equal about $1.7 trillion a year. Those are backdoor spending. They're called tax expenditures, but they're just a different form of spending. The revenue's lost. We want to keep tax rates as low as we can to be competitive. All right. If you eliminate a lot of tax expenditures or tax preferences, that helps you to keep rates down. Okay. We also have to recognize that the wealth gap is increased dramatically, that the income gap is increased dramatically, that most wealthy people don't make their money on wages, which means that they're not paying social insurance taxes on what they're making. They make most of their money on investments, and a lot of that they end up not selling, so their wealth goes up dramatically, but yet they're not subject to taxation on it. So,
And then they leave it to their kids with a
they
step.
leave it to the kids and they get a step up in the tax basis, although they have to pay estate tax, presumably, right? So, right. And so, what this lays out in the book is much more comprehensive proposed tax reform than historically Washington would do. Washington tends to do kind of incremental kind of things. Well, let's just bump this rate a little bit, or this is much more fundamental tax reform. More people paying something in income taxes, but the wealthy paying much more than they're paying now. And then we can debate what's the most economically efficient and equitable way to raise the revenue. I can talk about some of the things we talked about, but I'd be interested in your view on that. I mean, some people think progressive consumption taxes are one way to go.
Well, I'm a big fan, actually. As you and I both tried to become president under the Americans Elect platform in 2012, which they abandoned partway through the year. So we couldn't run on a third party ticket.
Well, my name was on it, but I declined the option to run because
Okay, I was trying to.
I was actually given the option to run, and the
I
reason
wanted
I did, quite frankly, is the time wasn't right in 2012. But the truth is, the time's right now, but that's not an option.
So I was running to make you my vice president or secretary of treasury, to tell you the truth.
There
So
you go. All right. At least I would have had a job.
yeah. Yeah, but then in 2016, I decided, I looked at Clinton, looked at Trump, and I said, enough already. We need to have somebody come out and say, an economist. We have 535 members of Congress. Not a single one has a PhD in economics. So I felt obligated to talk to other economists and say, I'm going to put together a platform. I'm going to run as a write-in candidate. I'm going to get registered across the country. That took a fair amount of effort, getting the right number of, Mickey Mouse can't win the election. You have to be registered for your vote to get counted, even if you're write-in. So I was one of the 5 people who could have won legally in the last election. The precedent take, but I put together this platform about how to fix the different things you mentioned. The press didn't take it seriously because I wasn't calling somebody a name. That was what they were focused on. Who's calling who whatever name today, and who's lying the most. So we don't have, I don't think, a functioning press in some ways in our country. But anyway, I put together this platform, and then I made it into a book called You're Hired, not You're Fired, but You're Hired. It's at kotlikoff.net. It's a free download book. So on tax see, I think we have to make sacrifice, but I also think we are doing so many things so inefficiently that if we just engineer things differently as economists would do it, we can get back on course without a huge sacrifice. For example, we have, as I mentioned, locked the poor into poverty by having all these different programs that are there to help them. But then we say, if you earn too much, or if you get married, if you've got kids and you get married, hey, you're going to lose this stuff. Or if you're a 63-year-old Social Security retiree who's collecting benefits, you earn more than basically the minimum wage, you're going to lose 50 cents on the dollar in benefits. We've locked the elderly into poverty because almost everybody takes their Social Security before their full retirement age, virtually 90% or so. So across the board, we have discouraged labor supply, discouraged saving. And so I would go on, in terms of tax reform, I would go with a FICA tax that does not have a ceiling, but starts around $40,000. I would go with a business cash flow tax, which is in effect a value-added tax. And then I would also have a progressive cash flow consumption tax. And the three things together, the way I've designed fixing in the book, not just the tax system, I would get rid of the corporate income tax, the federal income tax. So major reform here. But the way I've designed the benefit reforms as well as the tax reform, everybody at the margin is in a 30% marginal tax bracket. No matter how rich, how poor, everybody has the same incentive to work. So we can do whether we go that way or a fair tax or flat tax is part of it, or a negative income tax, Milton Friedman. There's so many ways, and I'm now trying to study, because we now have developed some terrific new technologies that do not include AI, that are much better than AI for studying this issue. Not everything is studied well with that particular algorithm methodology, but we're in a position now to really figure out, hey, how can we redesign the fiscal system with all 1,000 of its components and make everybody better off, or nobody get more revenue, get more people to work, and give people, so on that's my answer. That in that book, there's specific solutions, and in your book, you have a specific plan, but either of these would be much better than what we have.
Totally agree with that. And I think here's the key with regard to my book. My book, they're not necessarily my solutions. I did this with Alice Rivlin, may God rest her soul, and others. But we basically wanted to find out what the American people would support, because in the end, it's got to be politically feasible. We can come up with great ideas, but if it's not politically feasible, it's never going to become law. And so that was the key. What do the people support? Because if the people support it, eventually you can get the politicians to support it, although they are a lag indicator. So
I think, just one quick comment on that, Dave. I think my thinking on that was, if you are so radical that you say, we're getting rid of the corporate tax, we're getting rid of the personal income tax that some people love and some people hate.
Yeah.
Some people love the corporate income tax, some people hate it. Just get rid of it. And then you say, we're going to do something very different. Now you have people thinking, actually, they have to think about what is this thing that's different?
Yeah.
It kind of starts getting everybody on the same together, because now they have to think about it collectively, and you have an opportunity to really discuss the fundamentals that we don't want to. Basically, we need more revenue, but we also have to give people at all levels of wages incentives to work. And we have to make sure that the billionaires who are now paying nothing because of, borrowing against their capital gains and never realizing anything positive in terms of capital gains, so they never have to pay taxes. That would go away. So when you talk, when you change things so radically, I think that that may unlock the political lock that
Yeah, it gives you an opportunity, but public education engagement is absolutely key, no matter what you do, whether it's radical or not radical. And one of the things I also talk about in the book is, you have to have three things for any system to be successful and sustainable over time. Whether it's a tax system, a healthcare system, an education system, you fill in the blank. And by the way, all three of those are unsustainable in their present form right now. All right. You have to have properly designed incentives that encourage people to do the right thing and discourage them from doing the wrong thing. You have to have adequate transparency to provide reasonable assurance that they will, but you might catch them if they don't. And then you have to have appropriate accountability if people don't, but also recognition for people who do it right. And when you look at a lot of our major systems, our tax system, our healthcare system, our K through 12 education system, our immigration system, I could go on. We fail all three of those tests. So it's no wonder that we're not getting value for money and that we're on an unsustainable path. And
tell us what you would do on healthcare. What your book says on that one. I could tell you what I think, but
well, first, I think we have to look holistically on healthcare. What the people supported was that we needed to have universal access, to um, wellness and to catastrophic care. All right. So there would be a transformation over a period of time to move away from all the different piecemeal things we have now to where you would have a single pool, publicly financed for preventative and wellness and catastrophic. Okay. An opportunity for people to get more than that if they want, but that's universal. All right. Employers, unions, industry associations, trade associations, others could end up forming pools that would compete. You deliver it through the private sector. You have to pay based upon outcomes, not activities. You have to have a budget for healthcare. You can't write a blank check for healthcare. All right. Other things that may not be as big, to be able to negotiate over prescription drugs. There has been a change in the law that some drugs you can negotiate, but not enough. All right, and we ought to change that. My personal view is, and the public agreed, that we shouldn't allow advertising for prescription drugs because that drives consumption. Most major countries don't allow advertising of prescription drugs. Okay, and it just fuels consumption. So you also have to recognize that if there are going to be publicly financed and available programs, that they have to relate somewhat to income, as to how you finance it, if you will. So those are just a few things off the top.
well, yeah, let me just give you the economists. So when I wrote this book, you're hired, it has a section on every program reform has got like 10 bullets. That's it. So
Yeah.
people see bing, 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 bing. Here's what we do. And so I talked to all the top health economists in the country at the time, Zeke Emanuel and
Yeah, I know, Zeke.
yeah, uh, Uwe Reinhardt was alive
Yeah,
at the
Uwe,
time.
yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, and just the entire list. I visited them, and they all basically agreed on the same thing, which is, and I also talked to George Halverson, the former head of Kaiser Permanente, a brilliant guy. And the basic idea was Medicare for all, but the Republican version of it, which is the Advantage Plan, but a version of the Advantage Plan, we call it the Better Way Plan, the Better Care Plan at this point, that doesn't allow you to game the system. But we can't have this balkanized system with 6 different programs.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Everybody, as you just started out saying, yeah, everybody needs to be in the same system. So the employer, so if GM wants to maintain its employer provided plan, fine, but they have to live by the same rules, allow competition, but also allow people to join who are not GM employees. They can be
That could be an option.
They can be an option, but they can't have any exclusion of anybody. And you also have to operate nationally. So you can't, under Obamacare, what we've seen is that we've seen cherry picking, that these healthcare companies are there used to be like 5 or 6 Obamacare hospitals that took Obamacare. Now it's just 2. Over time, the better ones just said, we're not taking Obamacare participants. So there's just 2 facilities which are in not a great part of Dallas and very distant from a lot of where people live. That has to stop. We can't have this cherry picking, which is what has destroyed private healthcare for decades. And it's the reason we have government involvement in healthcare, because the private sector wants to cherry pick. They want to go for the people that don't have illness so they can make money on them and not pay out. So there's a way
Everybody
to,
wase to have their cake and eat it too, Larry. It's a human, it's a
yeah,
human
so we're
nature.
spending as 18, 19% of GDP on healthcare. We're ranked 21st in terms of
Yeah, that's right.
the quality of our healthcare
Outcomes.
healthcare outcomes. Sweden is spending 11% of GDP, so 7 percentage points less, and is ranked 4th in terms of its healthcare outcomes. Now, the Swedish, genetic composition is different from the American, so part of that differential has to do with nature, but a large part of it has to do with design. So if you look at the Swedish system, the Norwegian system, the German system, the French system, the Swiss system, the Israeli system, the Japanese system, it's all very much the David Walker system. It's and what I'm proposing,
Yeah.
one system,
They're compatible. They're very compatible.
with
Yeah.
competition, with the government paying, hey, David, you get a voucher, you can use it with this company or that company, they're competing, you can walk with your feet the next year, you sign up for a year, and the voucher is based on your pre-existing verifiable conditions, not on how much was spent on you, but on whether you have diabetes or not. And then there's no cherry picking right off the bat. And we're living within a budget because the vouchers are going to be added up to equal 11% of GDP or 12%. Maybe we'll have to gradually ratchet that down from 18 down to 11. But when we go from 18 down to 11, we're going to save our kids, but fiscally speaking, right off the bat. Just that alone would be a miracle, and that can be done overnight. It doesn't take Hillary's, enormous 5,000-page solution. It takes 10 bullets, and it's the same 10 bullets whether it's you thinking about it without an economics degree, but a CPA degree, or economists think about it. Anybody logical would think about it this way. Anyway, tell us about education. If I go to Cuba, which I've done, and I ask them about their education system, which apparently is really good. Everything else is terrible, but they turn on the TV throughout the country. The best instructors for, let's say, 8th grade trigonometry are teaching on TV to the entire population of 8th graders. And the kids watch it so we could do online education. We could have the Department of Education actually do something useful, which is have these courses online that every school system could use. We can have universal education, identical education, online education with kids with headsets provided by the federal government. And now the kids are not being distracted in class. And the teacher can go around for maybe half the day this happens, or different different instruction, online instruction, and sit with each kid individually. And if he can't get it this way, he can get it from another online course that's being provided by the very best teachers in the country. So I think we can use technology. If the unions don't want to use it, so be it, but they'll have pressure from their, from the parents.
Well, this is another example of learning from history, learning from others, right? I mean, we have some of the best post-secondary education colleges, universities in the world, although we're slipping, okay, based upon the latest data. But we're well below average on K through 12 education. And yet we spend a lot more money per pupil in many of these underperforming school systems. So you need more choice, you need more competition, you need to really look at the curriculum. You need to look at the means and mode of providing the information, which you're talking about. And there's at least two things I can think of that we're not teaching now that should be mandatory for anybody to be able to graduate from high school. One is financial literacy. And I know you've got some material available on that, which I'm looking forward to take a look at. And the other one is civic responsibility. And I think the absence of people having courses in that area is one of the reasons we become so dysfunctional, as a society. So those are just a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think national service, civic, right. Uh, just basic history and civics, history of this country. People are so undereducated about how we got to where we are and how fragile things have been throughout the course of our country. And also, it'd be maybe relieving for people to know that if you go back to Jefferson and Adams, if we think that Trump and Biden are screaming at each other, we should see what Jefferson and Adams had to say about each other, right? Pretty nasty stuff.
Well, and there used to be
Personal.
duels of which Hamilton and Burr were involved with, where somebody lost their life because they had such a strong disagreement about who should be president.
And I also got very personal. I think the allegation was that Hamilton just accused Burr of engaging in incest with his daughter. I think that was the case, but I'm
That was
not.
before my time, Larry, so I'm not going there.
That was, I mean, but there was,
I
social,
don't know. There was smoke at least. I don't know if there was fire, but
there's social media out there, and through different forms, through time. So it's not all that much different today. But tell us about Social Security. We have a few minutes left. Tell us
sure.
what you're you were a trustee with Social Security. If you
And
look at
Medicare.
this, and what
And Medicare.
and Medicare, and the projections are just awful. We have chosen just really quickly for people to see how this works, how the government hides things. I'm, let's say, Uncle Sam. David's a 45-year-old worker. I come to him, I take some money from him, and I promise him something in the future. I could say, David, I'm borrowing this money, and here's an IOU, here's a piece of paper, and when you're in the future, I'm going to give it back to you. I'm going to give you some money back. It could be exactly what I took with interest, or it could be, let's say it is, I could describe what I give you back as return of principal plus interest, that I'm borrowing the money, servicing it, and then hitting you with an extra tax in the future. Or I could describe it as taxing you now and making a transfer payment to you in the future. If I use the first set of words, borrowing principals, a service of principal and interest, now becomes, and I give you this piece of paper, that same transaction goes onto the books, now becomes part of official debt. The next year, we add up the debt, I have a debt to you. It's what I owe you in the future. If we call it taxes and a future transfer payment, it's off the books. It's that simple. So economics really doesn't define the debt. We have the same problem in economics that the physicists have in when it comes to time and distance. These are concepts that are not well defined. They're language, what direction and speed you're traveling through space, your frame of reference, your language, in effect, determines how you tell the time right now and how wide your laptop is measured. Same thing in economics. What labeling we do, what language we use determines what we report. So these numbers, unless we do it comprehensively, as you and I are both into, tell us nothing. The debt by itself is indicative of something, but it's not the whole picture, and it's missing most of the picture, I think. And you think?
And let's talk about that. Okay, first, let's start with debt. I'll come to Social Security. You have debt held by the public. You have debt held by the trust funds. That's intragovernmental debt, debt that the government alleged it owes to itself. I disagree with that. You took the people's money. You spent the people's money. That should be shown as a liability. It's not shown as a liability right now. and the delta between the debt held by the public and the total debt subject to the debt ceiling is about 25% of GDP. So it's not chump change, right? And then on top of that, even when you end up dealing with the debt held by the public and the intergovernmental debt, then you have to look at, well, what's the difference between what we've promised on Social Security in this particular case and the revenues that we expect to get for Social Security, and how do you discount that back to how much money you'd have to have today in order to be able to deliver on that promise? You can do it percentage of payroll, you can do a lot of different ways, but what's the discounted present value dollar number? And there's a difference between whether it's the open group, the closed group, or if it's 75 years or it's infinity, right? But the number that I recall off the top of my head on the open group, which means you count just not just people currently alive, but new people that might be paying in over the next 75 years. The difference between how much we have in revenues and how much we're expected to pay and what the gap is $25 trillion. All right, that's a lot of money. For Medicare, it's about $50 trillion. All right, so that's how you end up getting from 35 trillion roughly in debt to 125 trillion when you count things like pensions and retiree health care for civilians and military. Now, Social Security. Social Security was running a positive cash flow for a while. That's what built up these bonds. All right. Basically, an IOU backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, guaranteed as to principal interest. But now it's negative cash flow, which means that it's got to cash in those bonds. And if it's running a deficit, it means you got to go out and borrow from the public to be able to generate the cash to be able to do it. So that's what it's doing now. Social Security is in a negative cash flow. It's gradually cashing in these intergovernmental bonds. Its trust fund, which I call the trust the government fund, okay, different story. The trust fund goes to zero in the latest projection in 2033 for the retirement program. And if you do nothing under current laws, a 21% across the board cut in everybody's benefits immediately growing over time. That's why when these presidential candidates say, I'm not going to touch Social Security, I said, okay, you're for a 21% cut in benefits in 9 years and growing over time, because that's what you get if you do nothing. Okay. And so I think we need to do that. We reformed the program in 1983, the so-called Greenspan Commission. They did a number of things that need to be considered again, okay? And the public thinks need to be considered again. But they didn't solve the problem. And they didn't solve the problem because they didn't consider demographics. They didn't consider the fact that, for example, when I was born, there were 16 people working for every person paying into Social Security. Now it's less than 3 to 1. It's going down to 2 to 1, within 10 years. And demographics are destiny. And so next time we reform the program, we need to try to make sure it's sustainable, not just try to achieve balance over 75 years, but consider long-term demographic trends and make sure that we're in a good position at the end of 75 years and hopefully beyond. So we don't have to be pre-programmed to come back and do this again if the assumptions are reasonable. The public talks about several things. The public says, look, we need more revenues. So we need to do something with the taxable wage-based cap. They did that back in 83. They significantly raised the taxable wage-based cap, but they didn't eliminate it, okay? They said we need to do something about the benefit structure because while Social Security is not intended to be the sole source of retirement income, we got too many people relying on it as the sole source of their retirement income. So we need to change the benefit formula to provide higher replacement rates for people near the poverty level, lower replacement rates for middle upper income and upper income people, but not turn it into a welfare program. We need to be able to look at the cost of living index and to have it more reflective of cost of living for seniors, not the entire population. It's a very different situation. We need to get our savings rate up. Our savings rate is too low, okay? So in addition to have a solvent, sustainable, secure, defined benefit program that's designed to keep more people out of poverty, but not turn it into a welfare program, we need to be able to have automatic supplemental savings accounts on top, individual accounts that the people own the money, they control the money, locked up for retirement or death, pre-retirement, to get our savings rate up. Learning the lessons for the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, which has been very successful. It's basically the largest 401k plan in the world. Limited investment options, professionally managed, very low expenses, very good success rate with regard to its performance over time. So those are, the bottom line is a reformed defined benefit program with a supplemental individual account on top that can provide that is solvent, sustainable, secure, indefinitely based upon reasonable assumptions, and that can not only provide that foundation of retirement security, but can get our savings rate up.
Yeah. So, I think that would be far better than infinitely better than what we have. I guess my view is that the current system, which is about, I think, 88 years old now, Social Security, needs to be retired entirely because it has 22,000 pages. When people talk about regulation and why there's so many people so many of the red people in this country, are upset with the government, especially small business owners and who have to deal with the red tape. Take a look at Social Security. It's program operating manual system. You can Google that. There's links after links after links. And the system says that if you printed out the entire POMS, it would go 22,000 pages. This is 22,000 pages of rules, about 2,728 basic rules in the handbook of Social Security, about 13 benefits. That's it. So this is like the most
it's the government, Larry. you make that is a microcosm of the government. Okay.
Right there. So what I would do is I would say, let's suppose that Bismarck came back today and we never had Social Security. What would he do? He would not recreate that mess. He would do something modern and simple. And that's what I would retire. I would pay off everything we owe under the old system to the current workers, to the current retirees, pay off their accrued benefits, gradually lower the payroll tax as we pay off those benefits, but set up something which is much closer to which basically your second tier. I would make that the whole tier, which is very similar to.
And that's what Bush wanted to do, but he didn't have a guarantee on it.
Well,
Right.
he wanted to involve Wall Street and
Yeah.
pay his buddies there, I guess. I would have my laptop run the entire system, which it can do, because I have my proposal has people putting 10% of their pay, split 50-50 with their spouses, into their own account, for one for the spouse, one for them. The government makes it progressive by kicking in money for the poor, the disabled, the unemployed. Then it invested in a global index automatically by computer, no fees to Wall Street. And then it's automatically, and then there's a guarantee of at least a zero real return so that you're sure you'll get at least back your principal adjusted for inflation. And then the whole thing at retirement age is gradually transformed into inflation protected pensions, annuities, via conversion of the index into inflation index bonds and using those bonds to pay off the survivors of your cohort. So you get back in proportion to what you accumulated. That's 10 bullets, very simple, not 22,000 pages. It's a half a page. That's what I think that if presented to the public, that would change the conversation dramatically. So we need to figure out how you and I are going to run for president and vice president, who's going to be at the top of the ticket. I'm going to let you, I think you should be at the top of the ticket, but give us some parting words here about, you're too young to run for president, obviously, but maybe next time around we can have a David Walker ticket. Is that in your future? Can we get you to do that?
I have no plans to ever run for elective office again because it is not a merit and integrity-based endeavor. I'm happy to give public service that is more merit and integrity-based. But in summary, we live in a great country, but we're not as great as we think we are. We have a number of major challenges that we're not taking seriously. The biggest deficit our country has is a leadership deficit. We need to make sure the first three words of the Constitution come alive. We, the people, we're responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen in Washington. We're going to pay the price. We're going to bear the burden if our leaders don't start solving these problems. Young people in particular are at risk. They need to be much more actively engaged, not just on environmental sustainability, but fiscal sustainability. This is a problem we can solve, and if we don't solve it, the world's going to suffer. Whereas the environmental issue is one we can't solve by ourselves. And if other players don't participate, it'll never be solved. So, I've just tried to be able to continue to provide a wake-up call, a call to action, a way forward, solutions-based, common sense that can gain supermajority support of the American people. If we can do that, we can get elected officials off their duff, make some tough choices to make sure that our future will be better than our past. And that's in part what America is all about.
Well, I think we should just leave it right there, David. You're a great American. You've given enormous service to the country. I don't want to sound presumptuous, but I think that I certainly thank you for your service, and I think everybody listening and watching would do absolutely the same, and the entire country. Anybody knows you knows that you're the kind of guy that we should be running the country and being in charge, and not people that are out for themselves. And we're seeing both sides out for themselves in a very strong way. Power's so seductive. It's only I can run the world. Only I have the answers. Only I'm your savior. But we do have great Americans, and we need all of them to come to the aid of their party, the party being our collective party.